Wow, it's different being on the interviewed side. From the main street of America to your front page, I'm going to tell you in this video what I think I bring to your newsfeed every time I write an article. I'm a pretty simple person, but I'm pretty complex too. To ask whether I'm a photographer or a journalist or writer or producer or something else, it's hard, I think, to fit me into one single box. I'm a multimedia journalist, and my job is to present a story in many different ways. Right? On a news feed, whether it's in a blog, whether it's in a magazine or newspaper, maybe it's on a podcast. My job is to present the story however it needs to be presented, and do it factually, accurately, and do it in my own style. A style that I think is more relatable than a lot of the personalities that we see today in the news media landscape. I'm not sure how to answer that question because I think I do a lot of different things. I focus on a good story told well. Whether it's in print, whether it's on a blog, whether it's in a magazine or a newspaper or whatever it is, I think it goes back to a good story told well and told accurately in a way that a large segment of the population will understand it. Because I think news media personalities today are more entertainers than they are journalists. Because of that, they're losing the art of storytelling. They're losing the art of the gift of gab, so to speak, right? And I think they're missing huge chunks of the story. When I was a young kid, I had the opportunity to meet the singer-songwriter Nancy Griffith, who was from a little town. Back then it was a little town, now it's kind of a bigger city. Seguin, Texas, which wasn't too far from where I grew up in Floresville. I became fascinated with Nancy, and I became fascinated with her ability to tell the story. For me, music, and I'm not a very musical person, my wife is, but I'm not a very musical person at all. It always came back to an image, to a story. And for me, music told a story. So music oftentimes is an inspiration to what I do. So I guess it didn't come back to a picture or a certain story or something like that. It came back to music and to songs. And I knew I wasn't a very musically talented person. I couldn't play an instrument, nothing like that. I can't really sing at all. But yeah, for me, I think it came down to music. So I decided that I was going to write songs, write stories in a very different way. And I wanted to incorporate that with photography, maybe with a little video, though I'm not the best video editor out there, and with my writing. I don't know if there's one thread that ties all of this together, but for me it's curiosity. Just a raw, real curiosity that goes out without an agenda, without a point, without a purpose, and just finds the story. Finds a good story, and then my job is to tell it well. It always goes back to that for me. So what ties all of these together, no matter who I'm writing for or what platform I'm writing for, is certainly being able to tie it all together in a good story told well. For me, that's what it all boils down to. It doesn't matter who I'm writing for. When I'm writing for someone, I'm not writing for a specific group of people or a specific audience. I'm writing to a people, to a person. That's the beauty of it all. To be able to realize that as vastly different as we all are, a lot of us are still the same. A lot of people don't relate to what they see on TV, to what they see on Twitter, X, what they see on the internet, in their newsfeed. They just don't relate to these people. And I think that for me, myself, I try to bring a little sense of relatability to all of that. Regardless of who I'm writing for, as far as an outlet, I try to blend that very raw, real, centrist viewpoint that's not polarized, not to the left, not to the right, because I believe more people are more centrist than they are one thing or another. So growing up in a small town gave me a lot of interesting perspectives, right? I wanted to connect my hometown, which was a town at the time of about 3,000 or 4,000 people, to the bigger world, and connect the bigger world to my hometown. I grew up with a lot of people who lacked a lot of social capital. It's a small town with a lot of brain drain, and a lot of the people who live in my small town where I live today and where I grew up at, they never leave. They never really get out unless it's to the coast, or maybe it's, every so often to the mountains or whatever, a couple times in their lifetime, whatever. They never really get out and explore the world, but I found that they have a curiosity about the world. And so when I left my small town and I went to places like New York, to LA, to Chicago, to Toronto, different places, I started to realize pretty early on in my career, back about 2001, 2002, something like that wherever I went, people were curious about my little town in Texas and my little life there and the way that we live life. They were curious. And then when I would come home, on those rare occasions when I would come home, people back home were curious about the places that I went. And a lot of times they may not necessarily go out there and visit these places themselves, even though the world is a lot smaller today, right? They just hear the stories of New York, and they hear the stories of Philadelphia, and they hear about maybe the streets of Kensington or something, but they don't ever really go out there and experience it for themselves. What I wanted to do in my career was very simple. What I wanted to do in my career was very simple. I wanted to tell the stories of my hometown to the world and tell my hometown about the world. And that shapes the way that I write a story today, is being able over 20 years to try and craft those stories into something that the average person, the every man or every woman out there can relate to. So for me, a lot of times the way that I do things is very different. I think about stories. I think about ideas. I'm not a content mill, right? It's probably why I'm not very successful or very famous in a lot of circles, right? Because I am not constantly 100% putting myself out there 100% of the time, just chasing down every random idea that comes into my head. Early on in my career, I think you had to be that way, right? You had to just take whatever came across your desk, right? For me, in a weird sort of way now, it goes back to that idea of a good story told well. So when I get an idea for a story, I do some research on this story, I think about this story, and then when it keeps you up at night, and it wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you're thinking about this thing and you're obsessing with it to a crazy extent, that's when I kind of know that the story is the story that I want to chase, right? And that's why a lot of times I may only put out, 3, 4, 5, 6 stories a year, oftentimes because I'm not a content mill, that to just keep people tuned in to something as long as you possibly can to feed an algorithm. Because I don't operate that way, I probably do take a little bit of a financial hit, take a lot of a financial hit, but I think it creates a better work. And for me, it comes down to creating a better work. I start thinking about the photos, I start thinking about the video, I start thinking about how we're going to present this in a podcast or whatever. I start thinking about how we're going to put this together in all of these different forms. And if I can really see that in my head and in my brain, that's when I know the story's worth chasing. I have editors pitch me just as much as I pitch editors. Yeah. sometimes, and I turn down a lot of story ideas, a lot, because I may just not be feeling it. And I understand that they may not be feeling my story either, and that's okay. Rejection is part of this job. I'll admit I have a very backwards way of doing things. And it could come down to photos, it could come down to video, it could come down to all sorts of things for me. But at the heart of it, it's just a good story told well. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it ever does. I mean, you just go out there and you take photos, right? And you let the story take you where the story's going to take you. You don't go out there with an angle or an idea. You just go out there with this idea that I'm going to tell this story. I think that being a journalist, in my sense, is a lot like a documentary filmmaker. Even though I'm not a true blue hardcore filmmaker, I love the idea of making films. And I want to believe that every story that I create's a work of art. I want to believe that every story that I put out there for people is something that they can really sink their teeth into. I don't know how this, you ask the question of how my photography sometimes changes the angle of the story. Well, when you go into it without a specific angle and you just get this idea for a story and you let the story take you where the story takes you, that's the beauty, the magic of being a multimedia journalist in 2025 for me. It's the real magic of a career. This is an interesting question because I grew up reading a lot of Hunter S Thompson. The whole Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, Hell's Angels. I mean, just all of his books were just classic books. But also I read a lot of other books. I came up in the time when Friday Night Lights was popular, and Buzz Bissinger was a really big influence of mine, how he moved to Midland, Texas, and he became from Philadelphia, and how he became part of this community there in Odessa. That appealed to me. And he went out there with an idea, and he went out there, Buzz Bissinger went and told the story of Friday Night Lights, a story that I could personally relate to in a way that was beautiful. It was compelling. It was open. And there's something beautiful to that. And so I say that I'm one part Hunter Thompson, one part Buzz Bissinger, another part Matt Pierce. It's having a personality all to your own. But sometimes I do write in that very first person style where I'm kind of pointing myself, I'm embedding myself into this story. Sometimes the story needs you to be embedded. Sometimes it needs you to go out there and use this, as Hunter S. Thompson called it, the gonzo style of journalism. Sometimes it does that. Other times it requires you to totally step back. And other times it requires you to blend those together. Journalism can sometimes be a real dichotomy, and every story in its own way is told in its own unique way. You know how you earn the trust of people? You earn the trust of people by not going in there as a journalist. You go in there as a person, as a human, as one of them. And sometimes, especially in the smaller communities like where I'm from, it takes time. It takes time to get the city councilman or the head football coach to talk to you. Sometimes they never do. And that's when you just have to rely off of your observations and information that you collect. How do you get people to trust you? You show people that you're a real human being, that you're somebody that they can connect with, somebody that they can relate to. Out here in middle America, the center's on the right, okay? So that's a unique position to be in when you're trying to explain this to people who the center's on the left, right? And now we're entering into a world with, QAnon conspiracies and all sorts of different things, and, breadcrumbs being dropped all the time, and you get into all this thing. People hear journalists and they're like, oh boy, oh great, don't come in here as a journalist. Come in here as a real person who relates to them, who looks like them, who thinks like them, who talks like them, who acts like them. You can drink a beer at the bar with them, you can park it on the street and walk into the cafe and, have a beer with them, whatever, there's these polished journalists. And I had a journalist tell me one time, well, we never drank in the studio. No, you don't drink in the studio. You drink a beer with the people that you're out there reporting on, and that you're trying to tell their story to somebody else. We're not all high and mighty. We're not. If you go into this job thinking that you're the end all be all, you're the problem. That's interesting, because you can do a roadside interview with somebody. There's a difference between just simply reading statistics and seeing statistics, and then actually going out there and seeing the science, seeing the actual statistics and the actual data. Sometimes you can see how that data is skewed, and sometimes you can see how that data is just wrong, and it's just based off of general assumptions. If you go into a small town like Paducah, Texas, and you see a very different generalization than what data gives you. Data can be used, but data should be challenged. Because that's the problem with the world that we live in. People just live in a world of data. And we should present the data, but we should present the reality to it as well. So on this hand, you've got data. On this hand, you've got reality. What's in the middle? If you go into this with this idea like, I know the truth already, now I just need to validate it. This is what the data tells me is the truth. And you're going to end up with an incredibly skewed story. Our job is not to validate data sets that we go out into the field with. Our job is to go out into the field, observe, be knowledgeable of the data, collect the data, and now we go back and say, okay, look, here's the reality. So data, everything is the way that it seems. Reality, nothing is the way that it seems. And in the middle is the real reality. That's the real story. So I think you have to use one to complement the other, but don't let one control the other. Well, yeah, sometimes deadlines are deadlines, right? We all live in a world of deadlines. We have to. Yeah, I don't know. I just deal with them. I use different tools to keep me on track, but deadlines are deadlines, right? I'm totally used to working with deadlines. I don't know what to say about deadlines. If you don't like deadlines, don't do this job. I have a couple ideas that I'm shopping around, but I don't sit there and start doing this whole thing until, I don't know, that's a difficult question because stories come up every day. Stories come up all the time. Which one are you going to really obsess with, and which one are you really going to lose sleep over? That's the story you want to tell. But certainly, this is my work. This is my life. Journalism for me is a passion. Journalism for me is a life. And journalism for me is not about being an entertainer of some sorts. It's about being a storyteller, about being a documentarian, about telling the story of the here and now in some way, some shape, some fashion, however it plays out. I'm Matt Pierce. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment, and share.